Okay, welcome to our second session for this week, for week four. And this second session, we're going to Poland. We're going to look at a Polish topic, and it's actually the second, this is going to be the second study of an individual. We looked, didn't we, a couple of weeks ago at Karol Čapek, the Czech author, the Czechoslovak author. We talked about his work, and we talked about how his novels and how his plays and this kind of thing could give us a sort of insight into the prevailing concerns of the interwar period. Now, this week I want to move and talk about Czesław Miłosz, and kind of I want to talk a little bit about the Polish context. And also use Czesław Miłosz to illuminate some of the topics, some of the ideas that I'd mentioned in the previous lecture, the lecture which is just above this one on Moodle. In that lecture, I'd sort of stressed, hadn't I? We talked about how the communists in league with the Soviet Union had achieved the communist takeovers, the takeover of power at the end of the Second World War. But I'd often said, hadn't I, that it wasn't simply a matter of high politics. It wasn't simply a matter of political realpolitik and political maneuvering. There were, of course, people involved, throughout these societies, even in societies that were traditionally pretty anti-communist, like Poland, for example, there were very many people who went along, gave some level, some modicum of support to the communist takeovers. And Czesław Miłosz wrote a very interesting book, which is still in print. It's called The Captive Mind, and he attempted to understand how this happened. Miłosz himself was a fellow traveller. He went along, at least until the early 1950s, with the communist government. He was a diplomat in France. So he went along with this, but he was also, when he left, which is quite early on, he wanted to know and he wanted to explain why many of his friends did the same thing, and try in this way to explain, how people emerging from a war zone like Central and Eastern Europe after the Second World War might find themselves in the, might put themselves into the embrace of the Communist Party. So that's what we'll do today. Now, like I say, the context is Poland. So let's begin by talking a little bit about Polish history. It's impossible to understand Miłosz without that. So if we go to slide number 2, Poland's history, the way Polish history looked at the end of the Second World War was really a very unhappy a very unhappy period. In the early modern period, up until the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century, Poland had been one of the great states. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had been one of the great enlightened states of the early modern period, much more democratic than the British Empire at the time, or the Russian, or the Habsburg or the Ottoman Empire. It had been one of the major progressive states of the early modern period, with a kind of a noble nation and electorate, those kinds of things. Now, at the end of the 18th century, at the beginning of the 19th century, Poland had been in a series of partitions. That the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had been divided up between the other great empires, between Russia, between the Austrian Empire, and between the Prussian Empire, mostly into the Russian Empire. So throughout the 19th century, there was no Poland, or at least not one that was free of imperial control, of foreign control. And the national awakening, the national activists within the 19th century were trying to sort of confront this problem. They were trying to get through this problem. They looked back to the glories of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. They saw that this had been lost in partition, and they were trying to think about the best way to resurrect Poland. And of course, this kind of nationalism is not different. This kind of notional national awakening amongst intellectuals, amongst writers, amongst activists, is not unlike, for example, the kind of 19th century national activism which takes place in a country like Ireland, with all of its romantic traditions, an insurrectionary tradition, a tradition of working with the occupying empire. All of these things were also present in Poland. Now, at the end of the First World War, this dream, in a sense, was achieved. Again, not unlike in Ireland. At the end of the First World War, as a result of various decisions made at the Paris Peace Conferences, the territories that had been divided were reunited, and Poland was indeed resurrected. It was known as the Second Republic. The First Republic being, of course, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Now, there were various ideas about how best to consolidate the national revolution, how best to build the Polish state, and there were various ideas about what citizenship would look like, who the natural allies of this state were. Most people agreed that Russia was an enemy, but anyway, there were different ideas about how Poland should look and how the shape of Poland, how Poland should take place. There was also very serious concerns about the eligibility, about the chances of Polish survival. Polish state formers in the interwar period were sort of preoccupied, quite rightly, with very serious kind of existential fears about what might happen to Poland. Poland had only been together since the end of the First World War, and it had not been on the map at all throughout the 19th century. So there were many people in Poland who believed that this state could be once again partitioned, could once again disappear off the map. And of course, they looked at the map of Europe, which I've put here in slide number 3, and they sort of say, well, look, we've got we've got a hostile neighbor to the east, the Soviet Union. They'd already fought a war with the Soviets in 1920, 1921. And then in the west, there is also a hostile neighbor, Germany. And of course, Poland, just like Czechoslovakia in the interwar period, had quite a sizable German minority in the Eastern Marches, in the Prussian territories. Territories that indeed had once upon a time been German. So there was also potential threat of sort of revisionist, territorial revisionist threat. Now, the worst fears of the Poles were realized during the Second World War. Poland was indeed partitioned once again when it was invaded by the Nazis in September 1939. The Soviets activated secret protocols that had been on their agreement, the Non-Aggression Pact with Germany. And those secret protocols dictated that in the event of this invasion, the eastern territories of Poland would go to the Soviet Union. Once upon a time, before the First World War, they had been part of the Russian Empire. As I said in the previous lecture, there was still a kind of an imperialist mentality within Soviet politics, within Soviet foreign policy, and the invasion of September 1939 gave the opportunity for the Soviets to invade, to occupy, and to annex the eastern parts of Poland. And I put the map up just to show what they are. I don't want to make this too complicated in terms of borders, but Poland looked very different in the interwar period. It included places like Lviv, which is now part of Ukraine. It included places, as you can see on this map, like Vilno, which is of course now the capital of independent Lithuania. So the map was quite different. But anyway, these were all parts of the interwar Polish state. Now, this was a desperately unhappy period, again, for the Poles. In the Western territories, those territories which had been annexed or occupied by the Nazis, of course, we have all of the things that we would associate with Nazi rule in Poland. So Holocaust, the death camps, the complete exclusion from public life of Poles, normal universities, only primary school. Hitler's intention, of course, was to reduce the Poles to sort of, quasi-slaves, to reduce them to sort of, to sort of subhumans, Untermenschen, within the Nazi Empire. Now, the situation was just as bad in many ways, but different within the Soviet territories. When the Soviet Union took over what had been Poland in 1939, they immediately initiated a process of Sovietization to sort of ensure the rule of the Communist Party and to secure those territories to Poland. Now, this involved, again, mass incarcerations. It involved use of the security forces, the security police, the Soviet security police, the NKVD. It involved Red Army occupying Polish territories. It was also a very brutal and a very bloody episode in Polish history. Now, it's one of the reasons why, at the end of the Second World War, Soviet control and communist control was deeply resented and deeply feared by many people within Poland. The behavior of the NKVD, the behavior of the Soviets, in those eastern parts of Poland was, of course, remembered by many people. The crimes that they had committed, the killings, the massacres that they had committed, were very fresh in people's minds. The most notorious one was the so-called Katyn Forest Massacre. This is on slide number 6. The Katyn Forest Massacre of April to May in 1940. This was a moment when, in the Soviet-occupied parts of Poland, the NKVD rounded up about 25,000, mainly army officers of the Polish army. Polish army was quite political in the interwar period, quite national. The NKVD correctly identified them as a potential source of anti-communist resistance, one that needed to be eliminated, and so they incarcerated these 20,000 officers, marched them out into the forests in Katyn, and systematically over a period of a few days executed almost every single one of them, and did so in a very ruthless, very efficient, very almost scientific way, marching them in one by one and shooting each Pole twice in the back of the head. The intention was to decapitate the Polish nation, and it was quite successful in its decapitation. So that was one key reason why the Poles were very hostile to the Soviet takeover at the end of the Second World War. Now, the other one is something that we talked about last week. If we move to slide number 7, the Polish, the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. This was an operation executed, initiated by the resistance movement, the Home Army. The intention was to capture the capital so that the nationalist forces, the Polish forces, could control it and could negotiate from a position of power with the Soviets, with the Allies, now that the war was clearly ending. During the Polish uprising, but during the Warsaw Uprising, notoriously the Red Army, who had arrived on the banks of the Vistula River, which is at the edge of Warsaw, simply sat and watched as the Nazis extinguished with considerable aggression, considerable violence, the Warsaw Uprising. The Nazis essentially leveled the city, destroyed the Home Army. And once all of this was over, and once the Nazis retreated in a weakened position, the Soviets entered Warsaw, which was basically like low-hanging fruit at this time. If we move to slide number 8, we can see the extent of the devastation. I mean, it's really kind of like a moonscape of devastated buildings. In slide number 8, that's Warsaw after the uprising, and I think I mentioned in last week's slides, but I can mention it again. It is a very potent memory point in present day Warsaw, particularly, but throughout Poland, but especially in Warsaw. Warszawians, have a very strong connection to what happened in the uprising. Each district, sometimes each street, has its own stories of what happened during the uprising, has its own heroes, has its own folklore, has its own stories. So it's a very important memory point for many people in 21st century Poland. Now, for all of these reasons, Stalin faced a very difficult task in imposing communism on the Polish people. If we turn to slide number 9, this is Stalin's rather pithy quote, sarcastic quote about the challenge the local communists felt the local communists had. At imposing communism on the country. Stalin said it was like fitting a saddle on a cow. I must admit I've never tried it, but I presume it's difficult or pointless or a bad fit or a strange fit. And basically Stalin was saying in this kind of bizarre way that to impose communist rule on Poland was a very difficult task, was a very difficult thing to do for all of these reasons. Okay, now let's move then to Czech. So that's the situation in Poland at the end of the Second World War. Now let's then move to Czesław Miłosz in slide number 10. Miłosz was born in 1911. He was born in what was at the time the Lithuanian territories, the Lithuanian part of the Russian Empire. Lithuania, up until the end of the First World War, of course, was still part of the Russian Empire. Now, he grew up in Vilnius, again, today, the capital of independent Lithuania, but now in the interwar period, so the period after the First World War, Vilnius was a Polish city, was part of Poland. It had a very large Polish contingent, a very large proportion of Lithuanians, and also a very large Jewish population. All of this, of course, was changed with the Second World War. Now, he has a very good book, a memoir called The Native Realm, or Native Realm, which has been translated into English, was published in 1959, published abroad. Miłosz, by this stage, lived outside of Poland, of communist Poland, and he wrote this story. He wrote this account of him growing up in Vilnius in the interwar period. And it's quite a fascinating one, and it gives a real sense of time and place, and the milieu and the waters, the terrain in which Miłosz moved during these times. He was a burgeoning poet, a burgeoning author, making his mark on the Polish literary scene. And Native Realm kind of talks about these things. Now, he participated in the underground in the Second World War, but not in a hugely meaningful way. He was not part of the Home Army, for example. Miłosz's underground activities really did not extend further than translating poetry, than distributing poetry, than publishing a little bit of underground publications. So he was involved in the underground movement, but not to a huge extent. Now, he joined communist Poland. He went along with it, although he had not been a communist in the interwar period. He served as cultural attaché to People's Poland, to Communist Poland, from 1945 until 1951. And at the beginning of the 1950s, I think he was based in Paris, and he made the decision to leave, to emigrate, to defect, in fact, from the communist state. He had grown disillusioned with what was happening in this country, and and he decided to emigrate, went to France, and he eventually ended up in the United States of America, in California. I think at which one, maybe Berkeley, Berkeley University. I think, and he was teaching literature, teaching European and world literature, and he did that up until his death. Which was pretty relatively recent. I think he lived until 2004, which is incredible. I mean, all the things you would see as a Pole, living from 1911 until 2004. You know, Russian Empire, independent Poland, Soviet Empire, European Union. Even I mean, it's an incredible sort of life's journey. Now, if we take the slide number 11 very briefly, I want in interwar Poland. If we go back to the interwar period, the 1920s and 1930s, Milosz was part of a very lively literary and artistic scene. As elsewhere in Europe, but especially in Central and Eastern Europe, the interwar period, this was the high tide of avant-garde writing, of modernist writing, of experimental movie making. This was an incredibly rich cultural period, an incredibly exciting one. And interestingly and importantly, and no one's really written properly about this, but I keep thinking that I might be the person to do it, but I never get around to doing it. Interestingly, as far as I'm concerned, very interestingly, artistic radicalism very often went hand in hand with political radicalism. So people who were avant-garde poets very often sought radicalism also in politics, and this can be extreme left and extreme right. So, for example, some of the earliest avant-garde poets in Yugoslavia gravitated towards the Yugoslav fascist movement, and it's very clear from the way they talk about these things that they don't decouple artistic and political revolution. These two things go hand in hand. But by the same token, there were many avant-garde poets in places like Poland who gravitated towards the communist movement, the Polish Communist Party. And there's two very good books. One is by an American author called Marcy Shore, a book called Caviar and Ashes, in which she writes about this generation of intellectuals operating in Warsaw who experiment with artistic radicalism and then move also into political radicalism. There is also a very good book which I can highly recommend by one of these avant-garde poets who became a communist. His name is Alexander Watt. He writes an incredible memoir, which is actually a series of interviews with Milosz, in which he talks about his life experiences in the interwar period, in the Second World War, with the Communist Party after the Second World War. It's really a remarkable book. It gives a sense of the suffering and the tumult of a Polish communist during this period. And I really highly recommend this. It's an incredible, not just about Poland, but about the whole of Central and Eastern Europe, maybe even about Europe more generally. It really is a great book. And Alexander Watt is an incredible sort of commentator on all of these sufferings. Okay, now what about Captive Mind? Okay, let's move now then to slide number 12. Milosz wrote this in 1953, very soon after he left People's Poland, emigrated to France, and had become disillusioned with the communist movement and the Communist Party and communist rule. And the book is quite a strangely constructed one. The structure of the book is quite an elaborate one. Each chapter seems to be moving into different things. He talks about how, in the early chapters, he talks about, how, people are sort of suffering from moral cowardice. This is why they're not resisting the communist takeover. He talks about how people are only privately sort of saying what they really think, and publicly they're not articulating resistance, and this is assisting the Communist Party and its rule. He has a lot of very different ideas, but it's mainly about psychology, political psychology. The question that Miloš comes back to, one that he really has had to face himself, is why do people go along with this illiberal, authoritarian, totalitarian Soviet communist rule in Poland? You know, what is it that has seduced them into this way of thinking? How have they come to support this regime? Why? And for Miloš, this was not simply a matter of coercion. Again, it comes back to what I said in this morning's session, in the session above this one. It was not simply a matter of fear. It was not simply a matter of being terrorized by the Red Army, although there was certainly elements of this. It was a much more complicated picture, and it was only by thinking in this very complicated way could we understand why people were going with the flow, why people were supporting the communist regime. Now, Miloš was first and foremost interested in his peers. He was an artist. He was an intellectual. He was a writer, and he was first and foremost interested in those sorts of people. And the most interesting parts of the book are the second, the second part, chapters 4 until 7. I've written them on this slide here. In chapters 4 to 7. Pseudonymously, with these kind of fake names, Miloš introduces 4 people that he knows very well, who have gone on to support the Communist Party and the communist rule, and he identifies them, as you can see, as Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and Delta. So the first 4 letters of the Greek alphabet. Now, each of these is only a very thinly veiled disguise, a thinly veiled anonymity. It was quite clear from a very early stage for anyone who understood or who knew Polish literary circles who these 4 men were, who it was that Miloš was talking about. And if we turn to slide number 13, you can see each of these people. Now, I'm not sure if those names are familiar to you. That the first 2 are the most famous, Jerzy Andrzejewski and Tadeusz Borowski, Alpha and Beta. They would be 2 very prominent, very well-known literary figures, literary lions in Poland, and to this day, people who were very important. So Borowski, Beta, for example, was a Polish Jewish author who had been in Auschwitz during the Second World War. He had survived miraculously, Auschwitz, but because he had been incarcerated relatively late, and a few of those people who came late, managed to get out. Of course, if you came early, you simply had no chance of survival. And Borowski had written a very good short novel called This Way to the Gas, Ladies and Gentlemen. It's how its title is in English, about camp life and about such as it was, life and death, and being inside the camp. And with Borowski, in this chapter, Beta, Miloš was simply saying that this is a man whose life force has been almost extinguished because of the camps. He's really broken, and he's emerging completely broken in the period after the Second World War, and whereas his political vitality, his ability to sort of resist, his ability to criticize the regime, would have been quite powerful before this experience. At the end of the Second World War, he simply doesn't any longer have the resilience for it, and he is going along because he just doesn't have the force to sort of push back against it. Now, the most interesting case, I think, the longest case, is Alpha, Jerzy Andrzejewski, and I won't tell you too much about that because the idea is to sort of upload it onto Moodle, and you might go and read that yourself. It's about 40 pages long. Andrzejewski is one of the stars of the Polish literary scene. If we turn to the final page, he wrote an incredible novel called Ashes and Diamonds, which was published almost immediately at the end of the Second World War, published in 1948. And Ashes and Diamonds is a kind of summary of the terrible divisions, the terrible sort of fractures within Polish society. It covers the stories of three or four Polish families, and shows that, father is divided against son, mother against daughter, brother against sister. Some are supporting the communists, some are supporting the Home Army, some have not survived the war, some have. Some believe in political action, some no longer do. Some were supporting political parties, certain political parties in the interwar period. Some were supporting other political parties. And Andrzejewski's point here is to show that the real, the Polish society is like some sort of vase which has been knocked down by the Second World War and is now, completely shattered in these tiny little fragments, and putting it back together is is extremely complicated work. Now, it's a great novel, but even more interestingly, in 1958, the great Polish director Andrzej Wajda made a film of it, which is also, of course, called Ashes and Diamonds. And it's one of the classics, in my opinion, not just of Polish cinema, but of war cinema. It's one of the great anti-war films of post-1945 world cinema. I highly recommend this film. We'll talk much more about the film, and we'll talk much more about Wajda in a few weeks' time when we discuss cinema in Eastern and Central Europe. But for the time being, what's very fascinating is to chart the differences between Andrzejewski's novel in 1948 and the movie in 1958, whereas Andrzejewski paints a very complicated picture and is in some ways quite sympathetic towards the communists. By 1958, which was a period of brief de-Stalinization and thaw, as we will see in Poland, Wajda is much more black and white. The communists are bad guys, cynical, power hungry, power grasping, and the Home Army, of which the protagonist of this movie is a member, are depicted in much more sympathetic colors. So it's a very interesting way that the text is kind of transfigured on its passage to screen. So I haven't said much about the contents and the reasons I want you to look at this, but The Captive Mind shows is an attempt by Milosz to show the very many different ways that people might be seduced by the Communist Party. It's not just a matter of coercion. It's not just a matter of terrorizing people, of imprisoning them. There's a much more complicated psychological game and psychological process of bargaining, which is going on amongst many people within Central and Eastern Europe. It remains one of the great insights into sort of political psychology, into political mentality, and its lessons, I think, are valid not just for Poland, but for the entire bloc. It's one of the early examples of how this political process that I discussed in the previous section took place. Now, Milosz lived, as I say, to a ripe old age, lived up until 2004, carried on published a pretty decent study of Polish literature based on his classes at Berkeley, published a decent little novel called The Seizure of Power, in English called The Seizure of Power, which was about this process of taking over. Was a much more sort of straightforward thriller, but was also very good, and in fact won the Nobel Prize in 1980 on account of his on account of his poetry. I think this is the third time that there are three Polish Nobel laureates. Another one is Sienkiewicz, 20th century nationalist novelist, and I think there's somebody else. Of course. What am I talking about? Just last year, Olga Tokarczuk, a terrific Polish author who writes wonderful novels, won the award a couple of years ago, and she really is a wonderful author. I'm going to talk more about her in coming weeks. But I think for the time being, we will leave it there. That's how Stalinization happened, and I believe that next week we're moving on to talk about the Balkans. That's after, of course, the midterm break, and I hope somehow, some way, we will be able to get this class back into the classroom by then. That I won't have to do these recorded lectures any longer. So thank you very much.